Okay, so good morning to one and all. Now we are going to start with our second unit. Okay, so we have completed all our chapters from your unit 1 where we have learned about these servlets. Okay, then how to start with the servlet programming, everything we know, and how to have the database connectivity with the Java application if you are using servlet as your server-side programming. Okay, so this all things we have learned. Now your second unit is all about the things which is going to be there in your servlet as well as in your JSP. Okay, so your first unit was completely talking about the servlets. Your second unit is going to talk about the numbers of interfaces like your request dispatcher and then cookies and sessions. All these things are there. How to work with the input output stream files, that all thing you're going to learn in your second unit. And third unit is more specific about your JSP. Okay, the second unit is going to be used in both in servlet as well as in your JSP. Okay, and then in your fourth and fifth unit we are going to learn about more of your enterprise application technologies, which includes your EJB, includes your Hibernate. Okay, so till third unit we have the web application technologies, that is one is your servlet and one is your JSP. Okay, so maximum you can say 60% of your syllabus is talking more about your web application technologies. Last two unit is talking about your enterprise application technologies. Okay, and I told you that we are going to have a small test of your unit 1 of all the chapters together. It can consist of descriptive thing. Okay, and I've told you that it is going to happen on Saturday, but most probably you're going to get an information maybe tomorrow evening. Okay, so we are going to have an holiday on Saturday and Monday because of Bakrid and Raksha Bandhan. Okay, not officially declared, but I'm telling you that this is going to be the information we'll share with you in the evening by tomorrow. Okay, so considering that Saturday is holiday, so we are going to have that small test which I was talking about tomorrow. Okay, so please start preparing yourself. Enough time I have given you. We have just completed your unit 1, I think on Monday or Tuesday when you had a last lecture. So you have to learn, and we have already done so many quizzes. So I think, I hope that the concepts are clear with you. So please prepare yourself. Descriptive means you don't have to write 1 or 2 pages. It can be of 1 or 2 lines. Okay, so in that way we are going to have a small test, just hoping that you're going to do it properly and genuinely. Fine. Now the unit 2, the chapter 1 we are going to start with is your request dispatcher. Fine. Now the term itself, the name itself is going to say something, that it is going to help me to dispatch the request and the response from the client. Okay, now for this purpose I am already having some specific interfaces and classes available in the previous things what we have studied, that two packages, that is javax.servlet.star and javax.servlet.http.star. There were number of interfaces available, like maybe your servlet request and servlet response. It may be your http servlet request and http servlet response. Okay, so those interfaces were doing the same thing. They were doing the sending the request and getting the responses. The only response is, the only difference is going to be between your request dispatcher and those interfaces will be, you want to have a request, so you have a specific class, that is servlet request and http servlet request. They know we're going to work for you for a response. Okay, for response we have a separate interfaces. Now, but in request dispatcher, what is going to happen? It is going to help me to accept the response as well as the request, as well as I can send the response using the same particular interface, that is your request dispatcher. So that means you don't to have the separate request response classes or the interfaces to work for. But obvious we are going to use that, but it is not going to be the direct usage of those interfaces the way we used to do it in the servlet unit what we have done it. Okay, so we'll see the examples also so that you can understand it more better way. Now we are going to start with the introduction first. So here the request dispatcher, it is said that it is a very important Java class, or you can say in normal terms, request dispatcher is an interface. Okay, it's not a class, it's an interface which presents inside your first package, that is your javax.servlet.star. Okay, so you should know from where this interface is coming. It is coming from your first package. Fine. So now here what we are saying, that the request dispatcher is one of the important Java interface which comes from your first package, that is your java x.servlet.star, which will allow me to have my request and response. Okay, I can have the request from the client, I can send the response to the client. Here we are not going to use the term called as request and response. Instead of that, we are going to say that it is going to be include and forward. Okay, so here we are allowed to include the content into a request and response, or else we can just forward the request and response to a particular resource. Either it can be client or it can be other file presents within your application working for a server. Okay, so if I can give you an example, like what we can say last example, what we have done it in the servlet program. Say we have a HTML file, we have a servlet file, and we have a database. Okay, so how your request dispatcher is going to work? Now from the client, I'm getting the request. Okay, and that request is going to come from a client to a server, and then server's responsibility is to process it. Now, it is not at all mandatory that every time we are going to have only one servlet file. Okay, it can also happen that in an application we can have n number of servlet file. Let's say, for example, we have 5 servlet files. Okay, and now that all 5 servlet files are making one chain, that means each servlet file is going to have one stage, one validation step. So the request is coming from the client, it is going to the first servlet file, the servlet file is going to process it, and it will just forward it that request to the another servlet file. Okay, so what basically that one servlet file is doing, it accepting the request also, and forwarding that request to the another file. So another file can be anything, it can be again your HTML file, it can be again your servlet file, it can be your JSP file. Okay, not necessary that every time it is going to be a servlet file. Okay, now the second page who is going to accept that request which is coming from your first servlet after the validation. Okay, the first servlet file was not, you know, what we can say, the first the servlet file was not responsible for giving the response. Okay, the first servlet file was only about to process the request and check the validation. Okay, second servlet file is going to take that request from your first servlet file, and then second servlet file is again going to have some processing over it, and then it can show the response to your client. Okay, so this is how your request and response is going to work when there is a requirement of having the including of the response and forwarding of the response, or we can say including of the request and forwarding of the request. Okay, so this is all thing has been done by one single interface, that is your request dispatcher. Fine. Now what request dispatcher interface is, as I told you, that it's an Java class, Java interface presents inside your first package, that is your java x.servlet.star. Okay, what is the you can say the syntax for having the interface name? Always remember, if it is a predefined interface, you don't need to declare it, you don't need to create it in your program. Okay, now here we know that request dispatcher is one of the interface present inside one of the package which is predefined. Okay, so now we don't need to create this interface using this particular interface syntax in our program. What we have to do is we can just, you know, directly call this interface in a program. How we are going to do that? Say for example, I am creating a class ABC, so how I can inherit and how I can call this particular interface, saying implements request dispatcher. Okay, even if at all it was a class, then what we have written, it was been written as extends request dispatcher, but right now it is what is, it is your interface. Okay, so class ABC implements request dispatcher. So your program is going to automatically understand that you are trying to call one of the interface which is already available, which is a predefined one in your package called as java x.servlet.star. When you try to implement it, when you try to call this particular interface without importing this statement, your program is not going to identify your interface. Okay, so that way you have to import the statement first, this package, and then only your program is going to have that call from this package. Okay, now what this request dispatcher is going to do, it is going to define an object which is responsible to receive the request from the client. and it can be sent to any other resources, any other file. That file can be anyone. It can be your servlet file, it can be your HTML file, it can be your JSP file. Okay. Now this servlet container, basically we have learned about it, what servlet containers are and what servlet engines are, what are the web containers, what are the web servers. They're all same. Okay, where we are going to have the execution of our servlet files. Fine. Now, where I am having the execution of my servlet file, that container is itself is responsible for me to create the request dispatcher object. Okay, and with the help of that object only, we are going to deal in throughout your program for this having request and response. Okay, now here we should know that why we are using the request dispatcher for two reasons: for receiving the request and for sending that request to the other file and generating the response for the client. Okay, and for doing all this request and response, we need an object of this particular interface. So that object is being generated by your servlet container or a servlet engine, where your servlet files are getting executed. Okay, and in the servlet file only you are actually creating the instance of this particular interface. Okay, now that object which we are going to create it is going to be used as a wrapper, nothing but it's one of the class of your Java which is been used to deal with the primitive types of data into your server. Okay, means what are the primitive types of data? So we want to store some form of data which comes into the integer form, which comes into the textual format, string format. Okay, non-primitive was your arrays. Okay, so we are here, we are using this object to transfer the data or just send the data which is going to be in the form of primitive types of data, and it is been used as a wrapper class which is been getting stored into your server resources. That can be the server memory. Okay, and it is been located by mentioning the particular path name or a particular name. Okay, so what all things you're going to remember for the request dispatcher over here is the request dispatcher object needs to be created mandatorily, and that is responsibility of your servlet container where servlet files are getting executed. Why the object is required? Because it is responsible to receive and send the response to the client. It is responsible to have the request and generate the response for the client. Now the third thing is that the object is going to be used as a wrapper class, okay, which is supporting the primitive types of data to be stored in your server resources. That can be your memory, and it is been located in the given path into your server memory, and it is going to be identified by a particular name. Okay, so particular name is the object name. Fine. So I hope you have got this everything what I have just told you now. Okay, so please remember about all these things about this request dispatcher. Now we'll just simply have an example. We'll just have a comparison that why we need an servlet, like why we are requiring the request dispatcher basically over the traditional way what we have done it in the last unit. Okay, so we'll just read it out and I'll just explain to you, one by one what we are learning from this example. So now let's understand the concept of the request dispatcher with a simple example. We are just considering one scenario over here that we have three servlets, namely as servlet 1, servlet 2 and servlet 3. Okay, I hope this is clear that we have one scenario where we have three servlets and they are named as servlet 1, servlet 2 and servlet 3. Okay, considering that we are not using dispatcher right now, we are just taking to the traditional method what we have studied. Okay, so what we are going to do now, we want to send a request to your servlet 1. Now make a picture in your mind, students, what I am saying about that. Say I have a server, I have a client. Okay, using the HTML file, the client has sent some request. That request can be the registration form fields. The client has filled the details in the registration form, and now that data has to get from there and get it into your one of the servlet file. Fine, what example we have taken in the last lecture. So now when it comes to your servlet, basically you can say that when it comes to your server where the servlet files are getting executed into your servlet engine. Okay, now from that file, the HTML file, the registration details are coming. So if we have three servlet files now, servlet 1, servlet 2 and servlet 3. in one of this servlet, I have written one of the code which is going to accept the value of that registration form and will make a variables and will store all those details into the variables. Okay, it is not going to happen in all the three servlet files logically. Okay, but obviously it is going to have one single file. It may be servlet 1, servlet 2 or servlet 3. It depends completely on you which file you want to have that acceptance of request from registration form. Okay, so currently I am just considering that servlet 1 is having that logic written into the block where it is been having the variables who is going to accept the input from the HTML. Okay, now the data are coming and it is been expecting that it should get store one of the variables which has been created in one of the servlet file. Now your servlet engine is going to identify that the registration form details is going to get hold by your servlet 1. So what your server is going to do, it is going to pass the control to process that request to your servlet 1. Okay, so this is going to happen. The very first thing is what, even though you have a 3 servlet file, the servlet 1 has been expected to do the task what the client form is expecting to do. Okay, that is been given to your servlet 1, the control is been given to your servlet 1. Now after that, fine, if any other request comes for your servlet 2, that means any other form after registration, generally what happens, we get an login form. Okay, now in login form we need two more, the inputs. So maybe for taking that inputs and handling that inputs, we will be returning or we will be writing into your servlet 2 program. Okay, we are writing the logic for accepting those two inputs of your login details into your servlet 2. So now what your server has to do, it has to revoke the control which has been given to your servlet 1. Okay, from there it has to revoke it, come back to your server, and then that control is given back to your servlet 2 to handle the request, that is your login details. Okay, similarly it is going to happen for your servlet 3 file. If something comes for your servlet 3 file, that means if some request which is going to come and it is responsibility of your servlet 3 file, it is again going to revoke the control from your servlet 2 and getting back to your servlet 3. Okay, considering that the server might be in India and the servlet which has been running, it is in somewhere in America. So in this case, what will happen? The second request, which is going to come back to the server, okay, the control is going to come back to the server, which is located in India, and it is going back to the servlet, which is present in America. So for that need, this option, the traditional option, is not at all good, because if we have a heavy traffic in between request and response, so this traditional method is not going to work for me. Okay, so what I have to do, I have to find a solution, and we have a solution that is something being called it as what, request dispatcher. Okay, so I hope that you have understood the scenario basically. Okay, now we are just going to learn that how to avoid this kind of situation by using the request dispatcher. See, whatever we have just learned, it has been just demonstrated into this particular diagram. So I have a server, I have the 3 servlets. I have been getting the request for the servlet 1, and I am going to send the response back to the server, which has been transferred to your client. Okay, so now if I am going to have a servlet 2, if I am having a request for the servlet 2, I have to wait for the control to be coming back to the server, and which has been reallocated to the servlet 2. Okay, so this is how this is going to work, your traditional structure. Now when I talk about the another way, that is a request dispatcher, which will remove this disadvantage. So what we are going to do, we are going to form a servlet chaining. Now what do you mean by servlet chaining? We are not going to give the control back to the server. Instead, what we are going to do is we are just going to pass the control from one servlet to the another servlet. How it is going to happen? Again, create one picture in your mind. Okay, whatever I am saying, see students, we are into the virtual environment right now. I don't have blackboard or something like that to make you understand. So you have to be mentally present that what I am saying, and you have to understand and you have to imagine what I am saying. Okay, so now again we are going to have the same process, request and response. Again I am having a servlet 1 file from where I am getting the request from your HTML file. Maybe it is a registration form, and the registration form details should be get stored into one of the the variables which I am going to create, assuming that in servlet 1 I have those variables which is responsible to hold all those data. Okay, now if the servlet 2 is been requested, that means if any other file is been requesting servlet 2, so what used to happen in the previous form, the control used to get revoked from your servlet 1 and it is been given to your servlet 2 by your server. Okay, now here within an application, I have told you number of times, it is not mandatory that we are going to have only one servlet file. When I talk about the complex application, we can have numbers of servlet file. Okay, now within the application also, I told you that we don't even need to mention whether the file is a Java file or an HTML file to which I want to redirect to or I want to remap to. Okay, that means if I want to redirect from an HTML file to a servlet file, so in HTML file, while writing into that form tag, I don't need to write the file name of Java with an extension. It is understood by your application that this is the name of the file which is present within the application. I can easily search and I can redirect to it. Okay, so similarly, I can have numbers of servlet file. If the control needs to get shift from your servlet 1 to your servlet 2, it is never going to have a network in between your servlet file and your server. It is going to give directly that control within the application. Okay, so what is the advantage of it? When you are going to have a request and when you are going to have that control passing over the server, you need to have a network. Okay, over the network you are going to do that. Fine. But now in this request dispatcher option, in this servlet chaining option, what we are learning, this form is something we known as servlet chaining. Okay, so in this servlet chaining within the application, when you are passing the control from one file to the another file, you don't even need the network. Okay, so by that way we are going to increase the performance of your application. I hope you have understood this. What is the difference between what we have studied, the first one, traditional method, and the one which we have studied just now, that is your servlet chaining and the form of request dispatcher. Okay, now what can be the disadvantage of your dispatcher? See, there are number of advantages we have, hardly, like, we can consider one disadvantage, saying that the dispatcher is much more efficient than the traditional method, but in the case of large amount of data, we can just expect very low trafficking. Okay, so it is not even dealing with the heavy trafficking because there is no involvement of network we have. Okay, there is no involvement of passing the data from one end to the another end of the world, so we don't need to have that low trafficking. But still, somewhere or the other, if the data amount is going to get big or complex, then we can just expect the low trafficking. That's it. That is like one of the disadvantage you can have. Other than that, you don't have any disadvantage for the request dispatcher. Now when I talk about the servlet or the request dispatcher, we just need to understand over here, whenever I talk about the exchange of information or exchange of control among the servlets, like the way we have seen in the previous slide. Okay, so that means one servlet is passing the information to the other servlets or passing the control from one page to the another page. So within the application, when you are going to do that, it is something we known as what? Servlet collaboration. Okay, so you're making able, or you're making possible to pass or share the information from one servlet to the another one by just having the method invocations of those particular servlet files. Okay, now this all task is been done by your servlet APIs, which are present in, which is providing the two specific interfaces, or I can say the two packages, that is your basic packages, that is javax.servlet.star and javax.servlet.http.star. Okay, here the major is your request dispatcher, who is responsible for doing all this servlet collaboration, servlet chaining. Okay, this HTTP servlet response is just a class name written. You can simply write as star, because this HTTP servlet request, HTTP servlet response, or you can other have interfaces from this first package. Every interface we are going to use. Okay, there is a requirement of this kind of interfaces, but to just overcome with the disadvantages of this, we can also going to add one more thing in our existing program, that is your request dispatcher. Okay, So they are responsible for having the, dispatching the client's request from one resource to the another resource, from one file to the another file. That can be from one HTML file to the another HTML file. It can be from one HTML to another servlet, from one servlet to another servlet. It can be anything. Okay. Now, when I talk about the methods of this particular interface, that is your request dispatcher. Okay. So if you remember, we had the first package java x.servlet.star. Every time, students, I am just revising the two package name, the methods which we have in these two packages, the interfaces, the classes, because I want you should remember whenever we are learning these things. Okay. It should not there in your mind that what ma'am is talking about, that we don't know about it, should not happen. Number of times whenever I am teaching you any chapter, I am just revising because they're all interconnected to it. Okay. Now, when we had the two packages, so in first packages, if I want to have a request and response, so we had a specific class or a specific interface, you can call it, that is your servlet request and servlet response. Okay. Same request and response can be done by your second package, but second package is more specific about the protocol, that is your http and https. So there we don't have only servlet request and servlet response, but it is going to be what, http servlet request and http servlet response. Okay. Now, why we are using over here, and if you remember that we had the methods also in for both the packages. So when I talk about the first package, so there I am going to work with your service method, and inside this service method I used to call the servlet request and servlet response. And when I talk about the second package, which is responsible to deal with the http protocol, so there I was not having service method, I was having what, do post and do get method, where I was having the interfaces called it as what, http servlet request and http servlet response. Okay. Now again I am going to have the two methods for my request dispatcher, the methods like we had for the second package. Okay. Now, which method we have, forward and include method. In the whole chapter, when you talk about the request dispatcher, you are simply going to deal with these two methods. Okay. That is your forward method and your include method. Fine. Now, inside this method, I'm using the interfaces, that is your servlet request and servlet response, which is coming from your first package. So why I am only using this particular interface, not using the http servlet request and http servlet response? Because at the very starting I have told you that this request dispatcher interface comes from your first package. Okay. So that javax.servlet.star is giving you this interface. So you have request and response clear for this servlet request and servlet response. We cannot use http servlet request and http servlet response. Fine. So in both the method, that is your either forward method or it is going to be your include method, I am going to have a servlet request and servlet response and the respective objects for it. So that object I am going to use throughout your program for your request dispatcher. Okay. You can simply throw an exception, which can be your expected exception which can occur in your program, which can be related to your servlet, which can be related to your IO exception. Fine. Now, what this forward method and this include method is going to do, we are going to learn in detail. Just to understand, we'll just read it out what they have written over here. Now the forward method is responsible to forward a request from one servlet file to the another servlet file, from one servlet file to the another resource. That another resource can be anything. Okay. And what include is going to do, it is going to hold the content of the resource file. That resource file going to be anything again. Okay. Now to understand it more in detail, we are just going to have one by one these two methods. Okay. Before I go to theoretically, I'll just show you the diagram first. Fine. So this is the diagram for your forward method. Now understand over here, I have a servlet 1, I have a servlet 2, I have a user which has been running, say for example on HTML. Okay. And then I am having what, server. What user is going to do, it is going to send a request to the server. Okay. Where the servlet files are getting executed to handle that request. So what user is going to do, the user is going to send a request to the server. The server is going to pass that request. It will understand first that the request which has came from the user, that which servlet file is able to handle it. Okay, and it is going to send that request to that specific servlet file. Server is not going to understand it automatically. What we have to do, we have to mention that file name inside your HTML file, that particular UI, that particular fields been getting redirected to which file. So if HTML file, first HTML file, say for example 1.html, is putting the name of the servlet 1 file name, so that means that file is been redirected to your servlet 1. So when you just pass this request to your server, the server is going to identify that form tag is mentioning the action to get it redirection to your servlet 1. Server is going to pass that request to your servlet 1. Now the servlet 1 is going to validate that request. Okay, say for example I'm just having the login form over here, okay, in the user end, that is in your HTML. So login form is going to have two details, that is your login ID and password. And in the form tag it has been said that the login detail is been going to validate by the servlet 1. So I have written action equals to servlet 1, so that means it is going to redirect to this file after the request has been passed to your server. So that login details are going to get into your server. Server is going to understand, okay, the file name has been mentioned, that is your servlet 1. Servlet 1 is going to get that request. Now the servlet 1 is not holding any type of response. It is just holding the validation logic. Validation logic means it is going to validate the request, that is the password and the username, whether it is correct or not. Okay, if it is correct, it is going to pass to the servlet 1. Okay, and the servlet 2 is holding some response, say for example welcome message. Fine, so servlet 1 is validating. Once it has been validated, say for example users request or the users inputs are correct as per the logic what we have written in servlet 1, so that request is been forwarded using forward method to your servlet 2, where some response has been written for the client. Okay, so that response can be one welcome message. So the welcome message is going to get from here again in the servlet 2, from the servlet 2. Now the servlet 2 is not able to or is not responsible to show that response directly to your user. What it has to do it, the welcome message is going to get again from the servlet to your servlet 1. Okay, and your servlet 1 is only responsible to have that response. So it is like something your team leader. Okay, so your team leader is getting some request from your client, and the team leader is going to just pass that request and pass that task to your employees. Employees are going to do the work, and that show off thing is going to be done by your servlet 1. Fine, so that response is going to be given by your servlet 1 back to your user. So that means it is forwarding the request and fetching the response from the servlet 2 and showing it to the user. So all these things what I have just told you is been written over here. Okay, so your forward method is responsible to transfer the client's request to the another resources. That can be any file, it can be your servlet 2 file what we have just seen. The method is been called, the control is been passed to your servlet 2, okay, from your servlet 1. Now the response is been generated. Again the servlet is going to transfer the same control back to your servlet 1, and then the servlet 1 is going to show the response to your user. Okay, this was about your forward method. When I talk about the include method, we'll see the diagram first and then we'll come back here. Okay, so again I have a user, again the request has been sent. Okay, then you have a server. So again considering the same example, that is your login form, the two values are been sent to the server. The server is having the redirection file name, so that is your servlet 1. Servlet 1 is going to validate as per the conditions, like ID and password should be same what the servlet file is having. And if it is validating, authenticating properly, the request has been sent to your servlet 2. That means you're passing the control from one servlet file to the another servlet file. Now here that show off thing is not going to come into the picture. The servlet 1 is giving the opportunity to the servlet 2 that come forward and give the response to the user, and servlet 1 is not going to give that response. Okay, so here what is happening, that the control passing and getting the control back and sending the response is been avoided into your include method. Fine. So wherever it is as per your requirement, that if you want to have the response from the root file from where the request has been, control, or where the control has been passed to your another files, if you want the response from the same file, use the forward method. If you want to have a response from the last file where the control is presently available, you can use the include method. Okay, it is completely a developer's choice. So whatever I just spoke about, this diagram has been written over here. You can use an include method to include the contents, or you can say include the response from one resources, and that resource and that file which is holding the currently the contents or the response is able to share that response or able to show that response to the client. Okay, so this is how your include method is going to work. How you're going to create an object of your RequestDispatcher interface by using a method called as what? Get RequestDispatcher method. Okay, so you just have to call the interface over here, create an instance. That instance is being created when you are going to invoke a method called as what? Get RequestDispatcher method. And this method is going to get invoked whenever you are going to have a request object of your servlet request interface, which we are going to call inside your forward and the include method. Okay, and it is completely dependent on you whether you want to use the forward method or an include method. Fine. Now this is your syntax for your forward method, that is have the interface name, create the instance, use the request object, that is your servlet request interface object, which we are declaring inside your forward or your include method, invoke the method, that is your request dispatcher method. By this method only the instance has been created. Okay, and you can write the file name or the resource name where you want to just forward the details or forward the control, and you can use a forward method if you want to forward the request and response to this particular file. When I talk about the syntax of your include method, it is going to be remain same. The only thing which is going to change is what your include method. Okay, so it is going to say that include the response in your first.html file, which is responsible to show the response to the client. Okay, now we are going to just have a simple example, and then this chapter is going to get over. Even if it is getting extended, there is not a problem. So we'll just extend hardly 5 minutes if at all required. Still we have 10 minutes to get the to wind up the lecture, so I can just finish this example and the chapter also. So this is the example which we are going to do it now. So we have a client. Okay, so that is your index HTML file where we are accepting two inputs, that is your name and password. We have a button over here. So on click of this button, what should happen? Your redirection should happen from HTML file to your servlet file. Maybe that servlet file have some code to validate the inputs what the client is sending it. So while validation, if the validation is happening properly, okay, if it is the valid one, the client which has given the input, so it is going to get forwarded to the another servlet file which is having some welcome message. Okay, and if it is not getting validated, if something is getting wrong, maybe it is password or username or both, so it is going to include the response into the same file, that is your HTML file. So what is happening over here? From the servlet file which is responsible for having the validation, it can have both include method, it can have both forward method. Forward method is going to get invoked when the validation is going to happen, and the file is going to get redirected to your the another servlet file, or else it is going to hold the response, it is going to have the response into the same file where I'm going to have again the input from the user with some message saying that sorry, username or password is having some error. Okay, so where you want to have the content or where you want to have the response to be included into the same client file, you can use an include method. And if you wanted to have a response from the some other file, not the same servlet file, then you can have the what? The forward method. Okay, now we'll see an example for that. We have two inputs. So in the form tag, what you are going to do, you are going to have an action equals to what? The file name where you want to just redirect to, that is your, that is what your servlet one file. Okay, and which method I am using to do that, that is your post method. Okay, I am having two inputs to be taken from user. So this is your label I have written, which type of data you are accepting from the user. So if I want to have a textual format of data, that is again your text field. So I'm going to define the type as text, and I'm going to define the name for the text field as what? Username. Password, which type of data I'm accepting, that is your password. That means you're going to have the, the password in the form of asterisk. That means it is not human readable. So you're going to take the input as your password type, and you're going to give the text field name as what? Your user pass. And I'm going to create a button. Okay, and I am going to have the name for that button is what? Login. Now here the file name what I have written is your servlet1. What you can do is you can just rename it servlet1.java, or else in the action equals to you can write login. Okay, so any of the thing which you can do it. Here the names are different, but the emotions what we had, the emotions are same, that we are going to have the redirection from your HTML file to your servlet file. Okay, so we want to redirect to your servlet file, so that servlet file you want to change it, you can change it, but both should be same. Like if I am writing over here servlet1, so there also it should be servlet1.java, or else you can write login over here because the file name was given here as login.java. Okay, so just understand the emotions, don't see the file name, you can change it afterwards. Fine. Now what is important when I talk about the servlet, the two packages that mandatorily need to be implemented over here should be called in your program. And then I'm going to have one package that is your input output stream, which is responsible to handle that, taking the value from the user and then give the response back to the user. So that is been done with the help of your IO package. Now I'm going to create my class. I'm going to extend which interface, that is your HTTP. Sorry, this is your class, that is HTTP servlet class. Don't get confused between the class and the interface. Whenever I talk about the class, if I want to inherit any predefined class from the given packages, I'm going to use a keyword called extends. Whenever I'm going to use a term called interface, we are not going to write extends, we are going to write implements. Okay, so here I just want to work with the HTTP specific interfaces. So I'm just going to do what? I'm going to have a HTTP servlet class which comes from your second package. And when I'm calling the second package class to implement the servlet in my program, so I'm going to use which method? Do post method, because do post and do get methods are available for your second package. Okay, and instead of the only servlet class, what I'm going to write? HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response. So now students, if you want to just do it some other way, okay, you don't want to use the HTTP, you just simply want to use the first package. So what I am going to do is I'm going to remove HTTP, I'm going to remove extends, I'm going to write implements servlet. Okay, because servlet interface from your first package is responsible to create the servlet or allow the servlet programs to happen in your Java code. Okay, so either of the way you can do it, that's not a problem at all. Okay, so we are getting more specific for the HTTP, so we have just extended a class called HTTP servlet class. Now if I'm using the HTTP servlet class, what method I'm going to use? Do post method. I'm going to have a request and response object. Okay, I'm going to have an exceptions. Fine. I told you number of times from the starting where I have taught you about the structure of the basic servlet program. So we have to write these two statements mandatorily because I just want to decide the response format for my client, that in which type of, in which content type I'm going to show the response to my client. So you have to say that the response using the response object, which is responsibility of this interface to show the response to the client, saying that respond to the client, and I can set the content type which the client is going to see the contents. It is going to be in the form of text format and in the form of HTML web pages. Okay, now I've set the format. That format has to be seen by the client, and that should be written in the web page. Whatever response I am going to send to the client to be seen into that web page is been done with the help of your print writer. So that means that content should get written into your web page. That also we have to do it as a developer. So we have to use a print writer class over here. Okay, now how many variables, how many values we are accepting from the user? Two values. So one value username, that is your first text field name, which is accepting the name of the client, and it is getting stored into one of the variable called as what, n variable, and it is getting stored fetching from this text field. How it is possible? We are going to use a request object dot the get parameter method. If you remember the scanner class, we had a next int method, next double method, next method to fetch the values. So here what method we have to fetch the value from the client end, that is your get parameter method. Similarly for password, what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a variable called p, and I'm going to have a text field name from where I want to get the value, that is your user pass. Now, finally, we are just going to have a condition. If you remember the diagram in the servlet, first servlet, what used to happen? We had a validation. So what validation we are going to write it over here? I'm saying that if the variable called as p, which is holding the password value, if it is getting equals to what? Servlet. That means if the client is putting the password as servlet, then what should happen? Now the request dispatcher is going to come into the picture. Okay, I'm going to create an instance of a request dispatcher. I'm going to invoke the method which we have studied just now, that is your get request dispatcher method. Okay, and then I'm going to write the file name if this condition is getting satisfied, and I'm going to write that file name over here. So what I'm writing the file name, that is your servlet2, and that servlet2 is going to have some response. Okay, expecting that the servlet2 is going to have some response. And if I want to forward that request once the validation is happening properly, so what is going to happen? I'm just going to write a forward method, and inside the forward method, I'm just going to write a two object name, that is what your request and response. That request and response object is of what? Your HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response interfaces. Okay, so I am just accepting the request also from the client. For that need, I have just invoked the request object over here. I'm sending the response to the another file, or I can say I'm just forwarding the request to the another file. So for that I'm just going to write it was response object over here. Okay, so your forward method is going to forward your request to your servlet 2 only if the condition is getting satisfied. If the condition is not getting satisfied, what is going to happen is then you have to use an include method over here. So what I am going to do, I am just going to include the response also for one of the condition, that is if it is not getting satisfied. Okay, so I'm going to include the response. What is the response I'm going to give to the client from the servlet 1 file itself? That is, sorry, username or the password is having some error. And what is going to happen? It is going to get redirected to your the same file, that is your index.html file. Okay, so this is how your forward and include method is going to work. Fine. Now the last file where I am having some response in your servlet 2, again don't go for the emotions that the servlet 2 has been written over there and then again I have written welcome servlet.java. You can do the correction. Either you can make the servlet 2 over here, or you can make the welcome servlet over there. Okay, so same process, what we have done it, we have just written the class name, we have extended the same class HTTP servlet, we have a request and response, we have set the content type, we have written the print writer, and simply what I am doing it, I am just having a welcome message. So just wanted to have, if you don't want to write even this statement, it is okay. Simply write out.print welcome user. Okay, welcome, just simply write welcome to the Java world. So that is been shown to your client. Okay, just to make more interesting, what we have done it over here, we are just accepting the user name from the field as username, which that first text field we have created, and getting stored into the n. So for example, the username which was came, that was abc. So n is going to hold the value as abc, and it is going to show as what? Welcome abc. Okay, so here you're just going to have like this, putting the wrong values over here. So password I have given wrong, so what is going to have, include method is going to get invoked, getting to the same page with some response. And if the values have been given right, so what is going to happen, it is going to be redirected to your correct page or the servlet 2 page, where I am going to get some response. Okay, so here we are just ending with your chapter 1 of your unit 2. Tomorrow we are going to have a test for your unit 1. Okay, so we have almost 50 minutes to do that. So 50 minutes, out of 50 minutes I'll try to have I know that you people don't reply fast. I don't know what has happened to you all when you came to TY. Okay, there is no instant reaction, or we can say itna alsipan. I don't know how it came to the TYBSCIT. Okay, I can continue with this. Let me stop sharing this. Okay, I'll just stop recording and then I'll come back to it. If you have any doubt, you can ask me regarding the chapter what we have studied just now. Okay, and I'll just stop.